In the dry hills of southeastern Turkey, not far from the border with Syria, there is a mound of earth that looks, from a distance, like nothing at all. Low, rounded, dotted with scrub grass, it sits above the city of Sanliurfa the way 1,000 other forgotten rises sit above 1,000 other Anatolian towns. For most of the 20th century, people walked past it, grazed goats on it, and never once suspected what was buried beneath their feet. In 1963, a survey team from the University of Chicago and Istanbul University crossed the site, noted some broken limestone slabs poking through the soil, guessed they were grave markers from a medieval cemetery, and moved on. It would be another 30 years before anyone understood what they had actually walked over. What was under that hill turned out to be one of the most important discoveries in the history of archaeology, a site that has forced serious scholars to rewrite their assumptions about the birth of civilization itself. The story of its rediscovery begins in 1994, when a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt, who had already worked on Neolithic sites elsewhere in Turkey, came across the old 1963 survey notes. Something about the description of those limestone fragments bothered him. He had spent years learning to tell a naturally weathered stone from a worked one, and the notes didn't sit right. So he went to look for himself. What he found on that ridge, according to his own later accounts, stopped him where he stood. Fragments of deliberately shaped limestone were breaking the surface of the ground, edges too straight, too regular, to be anything but the work of human hands. Schmidt recognized immediately that this was not a medieval graveyard. He suspected, correctly, that he was looking at something Neolithic, and quite possibly much older than anything discovered in the region before. He began formal excavation in 1995, and the site would consume the rest of his life. He worked there for close to 2 decades, and when he died in 2014, the full extent of what lies under that hill was still not known. Geophysical surveys since then suggest that what has been excavated is only a fraction of the whole complex. What emerged from the soil, layer by careful layer, was not a village, not a cemetery, and not a set of ordinary dwellings. It was a series of large stone enclosures, roughly circular or oval in plan, each one built around a pair of massive T-shaped limestone pillars standing at its center, with smaller pillars of the same shape set into the surrounding walls like the ribs of a great stone cage. At least 20 of these enclosures have been identified so far, some fully excavated, others only detected through ground-penetrating radar and left deliberately unexcavated for future generations of archaeologists with better tools than we have today. The largest of the central pillars stand around 5.5 meters tall and are estimated to weigh somewhere in the range of 10 to 20 tons, with some unfinished pillars still sitting in the nearby limestone quarry, never freed from the bedrock, that may have weighed considerably more had they been completed. These are not rough, unshaped boulders stood on end. They are carved with clear intention into a distinctive T-shape, a wide horizontal crossbar sitting atop a narrower vertical shaft, and on many of them, faint low-relief carvings show what can only be described as arms, bent at the elbow, hands with long stylized fingers meeting at the front of the pillar below a carved belt and loincloth. These are not abstract shapes. They are stylized bodies. Faceless, towering, standing shoulder to shoulder in stone rings that were, by any reasonable interpretation, built to be looked at by human beings standing at the center among them. Radiocarbon dating of organic material recovered from the fill of the earliest enclosures places their construction at roughly 9,600 BCE, in the period archaeologists call the pre-pottery Neolithic A. To put that number into some kind of perspective that a person can actually feel rather than just read, the pyramids of Giza were built around 2560 BCE. Stonehenge, in its earliest phases, dates to around 3000 BCE. Göbekli Tepe predates the pyramids by roughly 7,000 years, and Stonehenge by more than 6,000. When these pillars were being raised, the last ice age had only just loosened its grip on the northern hemisphere. Agriculture, in the form we would recognize it, domesticated wheat, barley, sheep, and goats, had not yet fully taken hold in the region. The people of this era are generally understood to have still been hunter-gatherers, or at most on the very cusp of the transition to farming, moving with the seasons, hunting gazelle and wild boar, gathering wild grains rather than cultivating them in fields. There was no writing anywhere in the world. There was no wheel, no metal tools of any kind, no draft animals harnessed to do heavy labor. And yet somebody organized the quarrying, shaping, transport, and raising of dozens of multi-ton limestone pillars, arranged them with evident deliberation into enclosures, and carved their surfaces with an extensive bestiary of animals. Foxes with their mouths open mid-snarl, boars, snakes rendered in dense coiling bundles, cranes, wild aurochs, scorpions with their tails curled, and vultures with wings spread wide.
This is the fact that has made Göbekli Tepe such a genuine problem for archaeologists, and it is worth being precise about what the problem actually is, because it does not require any exaggeration to be remarkable. The conventional narrative of human development, the one most of us grew up with, runs roughly like this. Agriculture allowed people to settle down. Settling down allowed surplus food and denser populations. Denser populations allowed specialization of labor, and eventually all of that gave rise to the kind of organized, monumental construction we associate with early civilizations, temples, palaces, and cities. Religion and monumental architecture, in this model, come after farming as a product of the settled societies farming makes possible. Göbekli Tepe appears to invert that sequence, or at least badly complicate it. Here is a monumental religious or ceremonial site, built by people who, as far as the evidence shows, were not yet full-time farmers, built before there is any clear evidence of permanent villages in the area, built by people organized enough to coordinate the labor of what must have been many dozens, if not hundreds of workers across multiple building phases, without any of the technologies we normally assume are prerequisites for that kind of undertaking. Klaus Schmidt himself came to describe the site as evidence that the human impulse towards shared ritual and monument building might have come first, and that the demands of feeding the large groups gathered for building and ceremony at a site like this may have been one of the pressures that pushed people toward agriculture, rather than the other way around. It is a genuinely provocative reversal of the standard story, and it remains one of the more actively debated ideas in Near Eastern archaeology today. Not every scholar agrees with Schmidt's framing, and more recent excavation has found some evidence of earlier, smaller-scale settlement in the region that complicates a clean line between hunter-gatherer and farmer, but the core anomaly, monumental stone architecture appearing this early, in this technological context, is not in dispute. There is a second puzzle at the site that has drawn just as much attention, sometimes called the reverse stratigraphy problem. In most archaeological sequences, craftsmanship tends to improve over time. Early attempts at a technology or an art form tend to be cruder, and later ones more refined, as builders learn from experience and pass techniques down. At Göbekli Tepe, several excavators, Schmidt included, noted that this pattern seems to run backward. The oldest enclosures, the ones from the earliest building phase, contain some of the largest, most carefully worked, and most elaborately carved pillars at the site. Later enclosures, built in subsequent centuries, tend to feature smaller pillars, simpler and less finely executed carving, and in some cases a general decline in the scale of construction, before the site was eventually and deliberately backfilled with rubble, broken stone, and soil sometime around 8000 BCE, burying the enclosures and preserving them, unintentionally, for the next 10,000 years. This does not fit the tidy story of gradual technological improvement that we might expect. It is worth being careful here, because this observation is real, but it is also debated in its details and interpretation. Some researchers argue the decline is less dramatic or more uneven than popular accounts suggest, and caution against reading too much into a still incomplete excavation record. Only a fraction of the site's estimated full extent has been dug, and conclusions about which phases are best or worst could shift substantially as more of the site is uncovered. Still, the pattern as documented by Schmidt's own team has never been fully explained, and it remains one of the honestly open questions about the site. Why was it buried at all? This, too, remains unresolved. The backfilling appears, from the excavated evidence, to have been deliberate rather than the result of natural erosion or abandonment and collapse. The fill contains flint tools, animal bone, and other cultural material consistent with intentional deposition rather than gradual silting. Some archaeologists have proposed that burial was itself a ritual act, a kind of formal closing of an enclosure once its purpose had been served, perhaps to make way for the construction of a new one nearby, a practice with parallels, some argue, in later Near Eastern traditions of ritually decommissioning sacred structures. Others have suggested more practical explanations, that it reflects changing subsistence patterns, or shifting social or religious practices as the surrounding population's way of life evolved over the centuries the site was in use. No single explanation has achieved anything close to consensus, and Schmidt himself, before his death, acknowledged that the burial remained one of the site's least understood aspects. Then there are the carvings themselves, and here we arrive at the most genuinely contested corner of the Göbekli Tepe story, the one that tends to generate the most excitement online and the most skepticism among professional archaeologists in roughly equal measure. Among the carved pillars is one, formally designated Pillar 43 and often nicknamed the Vulture Stone, found in what excavators call Enclosure D. It depicts, among other figures, a vulture with a wing outstretched, a scorpion, a headless human figure, and a prominent circular disc positioned near the top of the composition. In 2017, a University of Edinburgh engineer named Martin Sweatman, working with a colleague, published a paper proposing that the animal figures on this and other pillars were not simply totemic or symbolic imagery but were, in effect, constellations, and that the specific arrangement on Pillar 43 encoded the date of a significant astronomical or catastrophic event. Sweatman connected this to the Younger Dryas, a real and well-documented period of abrupt climatic cooling that began around 12,900 years ago, in which temperatures across the northern hemisphere plunged sharply after a period of post-Ice Age warming, a genuine puzzle in paleoclimatology whose cause remains debated among specialists, with hypotheses ranging from disruptions in North Atlantic Ocean circulation to, in a minority but persistent line of research, the effects of fragments from a disintegrating comet. Sweatman's proposal was that Pillar 43 might represent a memorial or record of such an impact event, using what he interpreted as a kind of proto-zodiac to mark the date symbolically. It is important to say plainly that this interpretation, while genuinely published and genuinely debated in some circles, is a minority position that has been met with substantial skepticism from Göbekli Tepe's own excavation team and from most specialists in Neolithic archaeology and epigraphy. Critics have pointed out that reading animal carvings as star charts requires choosing, after the fact, which constellations are supposed to correspond to which figures, a process that leaves considerable room for the researcher to find the pattern they are looking for. There is no independent evidence, such as an accompanying inscription or a clearly established broader tradition of astronomical symbolism at other sites of the same culture, that would let us confirm the reading rather than simply entertain it as one possible and proven hypothesis among several. The archaeologists who have spent decades excavating the site directly have generally favored more cautious interpretations of the animal imagery, connecting it to totemic, mythological, or ancestral themes documented more broadly across early Neolithic sites in the region, rather than to a specific astronomical code. None of this means Sweatman's idea is impossible, and it is worth understanding on its own terms as a real, if contested, piece of published research, not a fringe fabrication. But it has not been accepted as established fact by the field, and honest treatments of Göbekli Tepe owe it to their audience to present it as exactly what it is: one intriguing, unresolved, minority hypothesis sitting alongside a great deal that remains genuinely unknown. What, then, can be said with real confidence about who built this place and why? The people who raised these pillars were almost certainly local hunter-gatherer communities of the upper Euphrates and Tigris basin, likely drawn from multiple related groups across a wider region, gathering seasonally or periodically at what appears to have functioned as a shared ceremonial center, a role suggested by the absence, at least in the earliest phases, of clear evidence for permanent year-round habitation directly at the site itself, though this too is debated as excavation continues. The scale of the undertaking, quarrying and transporting stones weighing many tons using only tools of flint, bone, and antler, along with wood, fiber rope, and raw human labor, implies a level of social organization and shared purpose that goes well beyond what we once assumed hunter-gatherer societies were capable of coordinating. That, more than any single carving or contested date, is the true significance of Göbekli Tepe. It does not require an invented AI breakthrough or a shadowy conspiracy of silence to be extraordinary. It is extraordinary because it is real, because it was built by our own ancestors at a moment we used to believe was defined only by survival, and because it demonstrates that the human drive toward shared belief, communal ritual, and monumental expression may run even deeper into our past than we thought, quite possibly deep enough to have helped set in motion the very transition to settled life and agriculture that we once assumed came first. Excavation continues at the site today, now under Turkish leadership with continued international collaboration, and it moves slowly and carefully by deliberate choice. A large portion of the site remains unexcavated, left for future archaeologists working with tools and methods that do not yet exist, a decision Klaus Schmidt himself championed, understanding that his generation's excavation techniques would eventually be surpassed, and that some questions are better left for those who come after. Göbekli Tepe was inscribed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2018 in recognition of its singular importance to our understanding of the earliest chapters of human civilization. Every season of new digging adds fragments to the picture and, just as often, adds new questions rather than resolving old ones. That, in the end, is the most honest way to describe this ridge above. Part of what makes Göbekli Tepe so difficult to categorize is that it does not fit neatly into any of the labels archaeologists reach for by habit. It has been called a temple, a sanctuary, a ceremonial gathering place, and a shared ritual center, but each of these words carries assumptions borrowed from later, more familiar religious traditions, assumptions that may not map cleanly onto whatever social and spiritual world its builders actually inhabited. There is no writing to tell us what they called it, or what they believed happened within its stone rings. What we have instead is the physical evidence of intention, enclosures built to a broadly consistent plan, pillars oriented with apparent care, and a concentration of carved imagery that repeats certain animals and motifs across multiple structures in ways that suggest shared meaning rather than individual artistic whim. Archaeologists studying the site have noted that certain animals, foxes and snakes especially, appear with striking frequency, while others appear rarely or only in specific enclosures, a pattern that hints at some kind of symbolic or mythological system without allowing us to reconstruct what that system actually meant to the people who used it. Sanliurfa. It is not a solved mystery dressed up as a cliffhanger. It is a genuinely open one of the very few places on Earth where the story of how we became who we are is still, quite literally, being dug up out of the ground. The animal imagery itself deserves a closer look because it is easy to flatten it into a single undifferentiated category of carvings, when in fact the variety and craftsmanship on display is remarkable in its own right. Some figures are rendered in high relief, standing out boldly from the stone surface, while others are little more than incised outlines, faint enough that early photographs sometimes miss them entirely. Predators are common: foxes, lions, and what appear to be wild cats, often shown with exaggerated teeth or claws, alongside dangerous or venomous creatures like scorpions and snakes. Birds, particularly vultures, appear repeatedly and prominently, which has led some researchers to connect the site to later Near Eastern traditions of excarnation, the practice of exposing the dead to scavenging birds before burial, a practice documented at other Neolithic sites in the region. This remains an interpretation rather than a certainty, since no clear burials have been found within the enclosures themselves, but it is a more evidence-grounded line of inquiry than most of the speculative theories that circulate about the site online, precisely because it draws on comparative archaeology from the same culture and period rather than importing ideas from unrelated traditions or eras. The question of who exactly gathered here and how often has also become clearer, if still incomplete, through decades of careful excavation. Analysis of animal bones recovered from the site, overwhelmingly from wild species like gazelle and aurochs rather than domesticated ones, indicates that the people who built and used Göbekli Tepe were still primarily hunting rather than herding, at least in the site's earliest phases. The sheer quantity of bone debris found in some areas has led researchers to propose that large feasts, potentially involving hundreds of people, took place there, which would fit with the idea of the site as a periodic gathering point for multiple dispersed communities rather than a permanently inhabited village. Feeding that many people during a major building or ceremonial event would have required significant advanced planning and stored surplus, and some archaeologists have pointed to this logistical demand as one of the pressures that may have nudged nearby communities toward more intensive management and eventually domestication of wild cereal grasses already growing in the region, an idea that ties the site directly into the broader, still debated story of the origins of agriculture in the Fertile Crescent. Göbekli Tepe has never stood entirely alone. In the years since Schmidt's original excavations began, archaeologists working across the wider region of southeastern Turkey have identified a cluster of related sites, places like Karahan Tepe, Navali Kori, and several others, sharing broadly similar T-shaped pillars, comparable dates, and overlapping styles of carving, though each with its own distinct character and layout. Karahan Tepe, in particular, has drawn growing attention in recent years, with ongoing excavation revealing its own striking pillar carvings and architectural features, and some researchers now argue it may rival Göbekli Tepe in scale and significance once fully explored. This wider network suggests that Göbekli Tepe was not an isolated anomaly, but part of a broader cultural horizon, a shared tradition of monumental construction spread across a region and a period, which in some ways makes the underlying mystery even more interesting than a single unexplained site would be. It implies that whatever social, religious, or organizational developments produced Göbekli Tepe were not a one-off fluke, but a genuine and comparatively widespread phenomenon among pre-pottery Neolithic communities of the Upper Euphrates and Tigris. What all of this leaves us with is not a tidy answer, but an honest, still unfolding picture, and there is something valuable in resisting the urge to force one. Göbekli Tepe does not need an invented conspiracy or a fabricated technological breakthrough to earn its place as one of the most important archaeological discoveries of the modern era. The verified facts alone are enough to unsettle old assumptions about when organized religion, monumental building, and complex social coordination first appeared in human history. Klaus Schmidt used to say, according to colleagues who worked alongside him, that Göbekli Tepe was likely to keep archaeologists busy for the next 50 years, and given that only a fraction of the site has been excavated, that estimate may prove conservative. Each new season in the ground has a real chance of overturning some part of what we currently believe, which is precisely what makes the site worth watching closely rather than wrapping in false certainty. The true story of that hill above Sanliurfa is still being written, not by any machine or hidden authority, but slowly, carefully, one excavated layer at a time, by the archaeologists who continue to work there in the full light of open scientific debate.